Boa tarde a todos. Vamos iniciar então a conferência do professor José Oliveira Martins, Scalar Dissonance and Polytonal Modal Impulse in 20th-century Music. Dissonância escalar e impulso polytonal e modal na música do século XX. Certo? Bom, eu não preciso apresentar novamente, o professor já foi apresentado em outras sessões, então eu vou simplesmente passar a palavra para ele e boa conferência a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde a todos. Queria agradecer mais uma vez realmente o convite e a oportunidade por apresentar o meu trabalho aqui perante tão distinta Assembleia. As yesterday, I'm going to switch to English and talk about some of my work that is being submitted for publications, but you'll hear it here as well. So this is a type of framework that I've been looking at for some time, especially in the repertoire that deals with the superposition or the combination of different scales, primarily in the repertoire of polytonality or polymodality. So if we look at kind of the reception of polytonality in the 20th century, you see that it was used as a label for the compositional practice of composers like Milhaud, Casella, Bártok, Stravinsky. Doesn't mean that every of these composers actually accepted the term, but it was used to them. And you'll also see that it was an elusive and contested term throughout the century, actually led to kind of an intense musical theoretical debate at times. And this debate has reemerged in recent years, for example, in the exchange between Van den Toorn and Dimitri Timoshko, etc. So Marc Delaire talks about it as a deeply paradoxical concept that has been described by detractors and enthusiasts as the destruction and the consolidation of tonality, the expression of conservatism and the avant-garde, the product of mere imagination and actual perceivable phenomena. So we kind of have an either-or type of approach. So as a conceptual problem, polytonality really has these enduring terminological discrepancies that prevent a proper definition. And it's interesting if you compare how polytonality was described in the early 20th century. So Jean Leroux says, for the past several months, much has been written about polytonal music, which appears variously as polytonie and polytonalité, but at the same time, a precise definition of the term has yet to be offered. And if you compare that to over 80 years later, Peter Kaminsky says, this consistent use of the term polytonality has inhibited an understanding of the music purporting to exemplify it, especially when it is by no means clear what constitutes a proper definition of the term and what conditions give rise to its existence. It's almost as if no progress has been made during all this time. So, of course, polytonality is used both as a descriptor for aspects of compositional craft and also as a kind of a critical assessment for the resulting tonal space. So Dan Harrison, 1997, writes, but to uncover compositional procedure is one thing. To analyze the effects and results of this procedure, as well as the conditions under which it flourishes, is quite another. The unfolding and employment of two centers perceived to be responsible for a bitonal composition or the combined tonal structure that these centers create is something rarely investigated. Bitonality, in other words, is quite under-theorized. So this is about 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, but it's still, one can say it's still under-theorized. So, a critical aspect of the debate on polytonality is really the capacity of so-called polytonal textures to afford divergent assessments regarding the tonal nature of the constituent layers. And when you refer to a layer, really what is it that you're referring to? And it seems that these layers afford divergent assessments. And also the regulatory principles triggered by or assigned to the combined musical structure. When you combine different layers, what is the resultant structure, and what are the principles regulating that result? So we can point to two theoretical tensions. One of them is the constructionist versus interpretative claims about the nature of the layered harmony, that is compositional graph or procedure versus analytical and perceptual significance of the layer result. And another tension is exclusive or strict, if you will, versus inclusive or loose views on the regulatory principles of polytonal phenomena. You can think of it as whether we're talking about literal views requiring the presence of full-fledged keys and associated tonal centers versus a more loosely defined notion of layered structures comprising the combination of tonally resonant layers, but not necessarily functionally complete keys. Okay? And so this leads to terminological variants like polymodality, polyscalarity, and so forth. So I'm going to propose here a model of scalar dissonance. And I should say that the notion dissonance applied to scalar really brings the analogy of metrical dissonance. The notion that you really have different metrical layers that are misaligned or not aligned, not completely aligned. So we're looking at scales, how do they align or do not align. So scalar dissonance in that sense. So we'll be looking at early century intuitions about inclusive or more loose views of polytonality by Milhaud, Koechlin, Casella, and Bártok. And so the model promotes inclusive views of polytonality and of scalar integration. One of the things that I found important in developing of this model is to circumvent this requirement of full-fledged keys and associated key centers or tonics. I'm actually not going to refer to them as structurally significant for polytonality or the types of structures that I'm looking at, but when I refer to them are more for heuristic purposes. I'm saying, oh, this is the F-sharp minor layer. Doesn't mean that F-sharp has a tonic function, just means it's that layer that has those nodes. So the model downplays the aspects of definitional aspects and focus on operational principles, like what polytonality does and how it is experienced, rather than what is it. Okay. So, and it grounds a listening strategy of reorientation across layers. How do we negotiate the different layers as we listen to the music? And so we're really looking at the music of Milhaud, Bartók, Ravel, and if we have time, Lopes-Graça as well. So one of the aspects I'm not going to talk too much about, but I just wanted to touch upon, which is the long 20th century has been quite detrimental towards the idea of polytonality. The detractors were in the majority, so to speak. And so my argument here is that the detractors of polytonality rejected the perceived potential for summoning multiple simultaneous keys or scales identities into a composition by holding mostly strict views of polytonality. So this reception relied on aesthetic ideas of organesis, unity of tonal space, contextuality of a tonal space. So ultimately, polytonality was seen as a non-congruent musical system and thus also a threat to the notion of coherence or unity of the musical work itself. So we have here an incoherent system, therefore would threaten the notion of coherent work as well. So system versus work. So here is just very fast. You'll see that polytonality has moved a lot of detractors throughout the century on perceptual grounds that you cannot hear from polytonality, on aesthetic, logical grounds, and on logical grounds as well. I mean, this one is the most famous one and probably the most funny one. So Van den Toorn says, questions regarding bitonality or polytonality can no longer be taken seriously. These notions, real horrors of the musical imagination, have been widely and mercifully dismissed as too fantastic or illogical to be of assistance. So it's really a strong argument against it. Of course, it's referring to the whole issue of polytonality in Stravinsky. But, so this is part of the more recent debate. Timoshko argues that beginning with the notion that we cannot, in some rich sense of the term, that is that strict view, receive two keys at once, Van den Toorn concludes that the Petrushka chord, and many other aspects of the Petrushka, is monoscalar in origin. So again, it only has one scale in origin. Stravinsky clearly does make use of multiple scales at a single time. Okay, and my talk will align much more into this view. Okay. So this is the plan. So talk a little bit about early century accounts of simultaneous tonally resonant layers and modes of hearing. Then I go into present a model of the scalar dissonance, some extensions to it, then engage into some more large-scale analysis, and then if we have time, a little bit of an extension of this model into expanded register. Okay, so early century intuitions of polytonality. So this is a very famous article by Milhaud in 1923, and it says la croyance en 12 tonalités définies, ayant pour base les différents degrés chromatiques de la gamme, devait, après avoir admis la possibilité grâce aux modulations de passer d'un ton à un autre, amener à étudier les possibilités de superposer plusieurs tons et de le faire entendre simultanément. L'écriture contrapuntique devait aussi contribuer à ces résultats. So the idea here is that if historically, if you had the notion of modulation to model the passage from one key to the next, so why not put two keys on top of each other? And he refers to the notion of modulation in simultaneity. Oh, that comes later or more explicit in Casella, but here you already see that the germination of that idea. So Koechlin, I'm not going to read the entire quote here, but so Koechlin talks about modulation intérieure des éléments. So the elements, the combination of elements creates an internal modulation, so to speak. And one important thing is that it says that in polytonal textures, dissonances are in repose, so they require no resolution. And of course, this is also at the time, that talking about the emancipation of dissonance that requires that you can be, the dissonances can be allowed to not resolve. So Casella does talk about, let's see, polytonality signifies to be sure the interpenetration of diverse scales, but it assumes the survival of the original scales. Polytonality is nothing more than modulation in simultaneity. Okay, so this is the notion that I was referring to. Bartók, that does not want to associate his music with the notion of polytonality, he proposes the notion of polymodality. But he has something interesting here that I will pick up on, which is a chromatically altered note of a chord is in strict relation to its non-altered form. It is a transition leading to respective tone of the following chord. That is, this is in tonal chromatic music. But in his style, what he calls our polymodal chromaticism, the flat and sharp tones are not altered degrees. So the chromaticism is not altered. Rather, they are diatonic ingredients of a diatonic modal scale. So suggesting that is really superimposing diatonic elements, and the chromaticism that results are not alterations of each other. So, starting with these theoretical intuitions, there are kind of three main aspects that you can get out of it. So one of it is that there is layers retain integrity, or scalar integrity to some extent. Okay. Also, there is an implied harmonic distance across layers. So this notion of modulation and simultaneity implies that there is a certain tension that doesn't need to be resolved, but there's a tension, and therefore they invoke the notion of modulation. Polytonal layers stand in dissonant relations that require no tonal resolution. So these kind of the three main points that I will take out of some of these theoretical intuitions. So, listening strategies, if you will, of layers of emancipation. So one is to think about, so you have two different layers, superimposed layers, and you can think that somehow this layer tends to resolve or tends to be absorbed by the lower layer. You can also think of the lower being absorbed by the upper one, but it's more often than not that analysts refer to this resolution. Whether the resolution is actually actual or just implied, it's a different story, but there is this tension of the resolution. In harmonic polytonality, there's this notion that the layers coexist and there's no resolution involved. Or in contrapuntal polytonality, the layers are autonomous. And so you can kind of engage three types of hearing a structure. Okay. So this is when we will start to get more into the models and the graphic associated with it. So you think about scale alignments. For example, here you have a scale of 4 sharps against a scale of 4 flats. Okay? So if you think of it, there are some notes that are in common. So this is the top scale and this is the lower scale. The notes that are in common are put into the middle layer, which I'm referring to as the consonant level. And the dissonant relationships result from the misalignment of the other notes. So there are notes that are aligned and there are notes that are not aligned. Okay, so how does that translate in terms of experience? You can think of it as, so there's a mismatch of layers. You can think of, for example, the note E is creating a chromatic pressure in this step, on this step. Same way the F is creating a pressure between E and F sharp, and so on and so forth. So you can posit, you can measure, so to speak, the level of mismatch versus the level what I call porosity, which is the notes in common. So porosity are the number of common notes, and the mismatch are the number of arrows divided by the number of layers, in this case is 2. So you have mismatch equals 4, porosity equals 3. And it's interesting, for most diatonic scales, this 4-3 also corresponds to other types of measuring key relationships, as we're going to see right in a few moments. Let's see. Let's put this into analytical use. For example, this is the same. So you have 4 sharps against 4 flats. 3 notes in common. You have this step, C sharp, D sharp, or D flat, and the G sharp, A flat. Okay. So this corresponds to the superposition in Bartók's Opus 6 number 1, the bagatelle. So you have 4 sharps that has 4 flats. And you notice how Bartók actually uses these common tones to start the piece right here. So there's kind of this nice counterpoint between the notes that are in common. And this, what I think is suggesting that we do is that we hear the different scalar environments in which these two notes in common are appearing. Right? So you kind of hear, go there, and then here you have the same two notes, but the notes around it are different. Okay. Same thing for the other note, the G sharp A flat, which occurs exactly at the very climatic point of the piece. And so you can think of it, so it's an arrival point, very emphasized, and as the lower level enters this G sharp, you can think of it as being reoriented as an A flat, and then continues on the lower level. Okay, so you negotiate between the two layers, so to speak. And so the reorientation works this way. So you can think of it as, in terms of local reorientation, that you have different intervals on each side. So for example, this one, you have the G sharp, you have 2 on the upper and 1 on the lower part of the scale, and the A flat the other way around, 1 on the upper and 2 on the lower. Or you can think of it in terms of global relationships, that you're referring to scale degrees within a collection. And again, you don't have to invoke the notion of a tonic for that. It's just more the position of those scales within a 4 diatonic collection. Okay, so let's listen to this, if the sound is good.
Milhaud, so that is do Brazil. So here we have very clearly a juxtaposition or superposition of one layer with another, that you actually have a pentachord in the left hand and a complete scale that corresponds to a B major scale. Now, the interesting thing is, so you have only one note in common in those two layers, which appears a number of times exactly in both hands. And so it's interesting to see how locally, for example, you have B here, so here, for example, the local perspective, you have 1, 2 semitones versus 2, 1, and it's exactly what's happening here. So B, A sharp, C sharp, and B, A, C. So you have that played out of a local reorientation. Now, the other thing that you can do with this type of graphic is that you notice, so if you have here a pentachord, one could say that E and F sharp can somehow be assimilated by the lower level. Okay, so there's no reason why they shouldn't be assimilated, and so here you would complete the graph. So E and F sharp can be part of this larger scale. It corresponds to a G major 1 diatonic scale. Now the interesting thing here is that as you close this loop, so to speak, for example, you see here the mismatch is 3.5, here this mismatch is 4. So, and basically it's because of this D sharp is creating an added point of chromatic pressure. And Milhaud really uses the D sharp to end the phrases, kind of give emphasis to that note. And what results also is that you have 3 notes of porosity, the B, F sharp, E, and that's exactly what is going to start and end the piece with, but the first theme as well. So let's listen to this. Generalize it, or first understand some of the properties of the model and then generalize it a little bit. So one of the interesting things is, so if you have the mismatch between 4 sharps against 4 flats, as I said, the mismatch is 4, and you can think, okay, let's look at voice leading or harmonic distance in terms of perfect fifths, right? And you actually have the same, so you have 1, 1, 1, 1. So voice leading is also 4 semitones away, and the harmonic distance is 4 perfect fifths, so it's also 4. So you would think, oh, mismatch is just a different way of expressing expressing the same type of measurements that other tools are already using. But that's actually not the case. Look here, if you look at, for example, C major against F sharp major, so the 0 against 6. So the mismatch here is actually 5, voice leading is 6, and harmonic distance is 6. So mismatch here is kind of opens the door. Mismatch, maybe it's actually a different tool of measuring. You can think of it as measuring the roughness or the friction between the scales is different from the voice leading or harmonic distance. For example, if you superpose F sharp acoustic with B flat acoustic, also mismatch is 3, voice leading is 4. So there's something different about this type of measuring distances or qualities of roughness. Okay, so why is this so? Why is there a different type of measurement? Well, because basically you can have what you call, or what I call a displacement distance versus a grouping distance. And again, I'm here referring to metrical dissonance for some of these names. So if you think of this, an analogy is to think of time going this way. This would be the same as a syncopation. So ba 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 ba, and here is a ba ba ba. Right? So you can, if you think of it going this way, it would feel like a syncopation. Where this one would feel like a Milhaud, right? We had like 3 against 2, so to speak. Okay, and so what happens is that in these situations, mismatch is the same as voice leading. In these situations, mismatch is minus 0.5 of the voice leading. Okay, so it's we can think of it as 2 types of scalar distance. A little bit more of theory building here. So you can think of it as syncopation, Milhaud, and consecutive notes, which kind of to the side. We'll talk about this a bit later. So the idea is that you can also have superimpositions that are closed. That is, the first and the last note of the scale coincide. So you have a closed group, or a semi-open, or completely open, right? You can think of this, for example, F G and this against F sharp G sharp. So they don't close, but yet there's a roughness, there's a friction between the layers. So I also wanted to think about the notion of indirect dissonance, and again, I'm relying on the framework of metrical distance. For example, this piece by Bartók, which is very used pedagogically to talk about the octatonic scale, right? So you have basically two tetrachords, A, B, C, D here, and A flat, G flat, F, E flat. So you have 2 tetrachords, and you can think of it as a single octatonic scale, right? Tone, semitone, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, the interesting thing, and this corresponds to kind of a listening intuition that I had, is that I hear a bit of roughness here and here. Or another way of thinking about it, these semitones, the B, C, or the G flat F, these semitones feel quite different from these semitones across the layers. Okay, so if you have a different feeling for how semitones sound, how can you formulate or you can formalize that intuition? And so you can think of it as a kind of indirect dissonance, that this A still is creates a bit of roughness there, and the A flat creates a bit of roughness there. Okay, so let's listen to this. Can I ask how am I doing in terms of time? Is anyone keeping time?
You have more 20 minutes.
Sorry?
20. You have more 20 minutes.
Okay. So I'll go up a little bit. One of the ways you can think about is up to now we've been addressing scales that the steps are opposed to two semitones, right? But you can posit or can you engage in aspects where you can have a step is a bit larger. And so you can think of it when there is a note against these, it creates porosity. Here you could think it creates indirect mismatch, but in the center, there's a potential for assimilation. And we notice here, like in the framework for Soledades do Brasil, that you had the pentachord in the lower, and I said the top notes were assimilated because you had a perfect fourth between the first and the last note. So it's a larger gap that can assimilate other notes. So for example, this other piece that's also used as an example of octatonicity by Bartók. So you can think of it as two layers here of 016, 0167, and the consecutive steps are kind of creating chromatic pressure in the gaps, in the bigger gaps. So this is, you can think of this. And if you don't want to retain this as a step, as the experience of a step, then you're more likely to hear the entire result as a single octatonic scale rather than the two layers that are resisting to fuse. Okay. Because we still have a lot to go. So now some larger scale analysis. Of course, Soledades do Brasil is really a monument to polytonality, so there's a lot of it you can go and look. One interesting thing here in Botafogo is, again, you have a pentachord. Here it's too small, you probably cannot see, but so you have a pentachord in the left hand and a complete F sharp minor scale on top. Now the interesting thing is, for example, the F is one common tone, and of course here, it's tempting to hear the lower level, especially because it starts by itself as in F minor, and the F of course has this kind of tonic function. And so when the upper layer comes in, up to here, it's very actually easy to assimilate the top layer because you have C sharp, D sharp, E sharp that can be understood as the flat 6, flat 7, and 1 or 8, of F prime. So, but it's really with the arrival of this F sharp here that you notice that, oh, these are actually two different layers. So, and so this is it. So this can be easily assimilated by the lower level, and it's with the arrival of the F sharp that you notice that, oh, you entered into a type of friction between the two layers. Now, the way Milhaud launches the phrase is that he's going to end with C sharp, C natural. And here I would say that it's really a process of reorientation, because up to there you'll hear kind of an independent layer, and here the C sharp is going to be heard as a flat 6 as we go being reoriented towards C. Okay, so it's as if so we are here on this C sharp belonging to the upper level, but then is being assimilated to the lower level. Okay, as a flat 6 to 5. So let's and the second part. Again, it's an interesting strategy. So at first we have a pentachord, so we have a gap between C and F, and that's exactly what's being explored on the second part. This gap between C and F, for the most part, here with scalar dissonance, here with porosity between the two layers. Let's listen to this. Some Bartók again. Here, what we have the second theme of the first quartet. So we have a juxtaposition again, also of a pentachord that is given by the cello and the upper violin, and kind of in the feeling of this sandwich as the viola and later by the second violin, which have really an extended scale. It's over a diatonic scale. So has A sharp on one side and A natural on the other. It's an interesting one. So here are the layers. What's interesting about this is that later in the theme you get a thematic area that has, it's all based on a single scale. Okay? So there's no, what's here, there's a lot of scalar dissonance, of mismatch. Here there's no mismatch at all. Okay? And using these types of affinity spaces that I talk about, you notice how here the mismatch is reflected in distances in this space that embeds all diatonic collections, and this part here mediates exactly this large distance. So let's listen to this.
10.
Okay, so I'll just talk about this one briefly. So Ravel's Frontal Speeds, which is a uni piece he wrote towards the end of World War I, it's for 5 hands. It's a very bizarre piece. And so here really what we get is that we have all of these multiple layers, and you can think of ways in which the layers are really interacting. And so you can it starts first with these 2 hands, and then it joins a 3rd hand, and then the 5 hands. So here the important thing is to notice the types of mismatches that the layers are creating against each other, but also whether these larger steps are actually heard or not as a step. So whether or not we want to keep these different layers separate or they coalesce, it's a perceptual problem as well as it is as a formal problem. A formal actually is not a problem. You can keep it separate. Perceptually, then there's that. So I'll just go on. Maybe you can hear just a little bit of it, and we move on.
So basically here what I'm looking at is a notion of polytonality that includes both the superimposition of scales, but also somehow accounts for how they are juxtaposed sequentially. And so this piece is interesting because at some point you have this chromatic semitone F against F sharp, and in the melody you have the chromatic semitone linearized in diatonic fashion. And there's this common tone C that then receives a semitone BC and a chromatic semitone C sharp C natural, and at the very end the opposite C sharp against B sharp and C sharp. So we'll just listen to it. Sorry for the fast explanation. It's beautiful music.
So I'm going to skip this example completely. Just come to my last example. So the music of Lopes-Graça. So and we already see a few instances of this in say, the music of Bartók. The example that we analyzed is that sometimes one layer itself also has a sort of mismatch. For example, here we have F sharp against F in a single layer. So you can have a type of dissonance embedded in a single layer, rather than think of it as a scalar layer with no mismatches. So one interesting thing is to kind of adapt or generalize the model that I've been working with here. So in this case, for example, there are no common terms between the two layers. And to think of it, how is it addressed in terms of register, okay? So here, the lower level, for example, uses the C major triad, okay? So you have it here. And the upper level, as you go, then you get the other notes, okay? And so you can still posit the types of mismatches between notes and steps against the other layer. For example, here the C natural is creating a mismatch between on this step B and C sharp, but also the F and the F sharp. You notice here that the F is creating an indirect mismatch against this F sharp, and the F sharp is creating an indirect mismatch against the F. So you can kind of have a registral approach to the issue. So this is the entire piece as it goes. I'm not going to get into a lot of explanations, except to say that at the very end you have a lot of mismatches embedded within a single layer. So let's listen to some of these.
Thank you very much. It's a very brilliant and quite inspiring talk. My question would be, have you ever thought about generalizing your model in terms of distillations? In Milhaud, we have published at least a couple of articles quite interesting on distillating this kind of matching, mismatching tonality, polytonality models. And I believe in terms of distillating these, we can learn many aspects of relationships, inner relationships, hidden ones, in terms of periodic and aperiodic arrangements. For instance, in Aaron's distillation.
Short answer, no, I don't know the work of, I know of Milhaud, but I don't know his work. I'm afraid I don't have the math capability to generalize it in that direction, but
you want to work with me, we'll be happy to.
Questions? Roger?
Professor Martins, there was a frame, a slide with a quote of Casella.
With the code of Casella?
To the trazing of the tones, Casella says polytonality was nothing but simultaneous modulation. So I stopped there. After, so I listened the examples, guided, following the idea of Casella. What's your opinion about that quotation? The examples make me agree that Casella. I'm sorry. What about you?
Well, I mean, I agree as well. One of the reasons why I chose this quote and I built the entire system on this notion of modulation and simultaneity. And the way I take it is that the layers have an implied harmonic distance between them, and they create a dissonance that doesn't necessarily need to be resolved compositionally, although, for example, Bartók does resolve it by choice. In that example, that he has a distance and it kind of synthesizes at the end of the theme. But that's a compositional choice; it's not by default. Thank you for the question.
Two questions, both pretty straightforward. The first one is, and we've talked about this, do you think that this is the same process, procedure, phenomenon as the Russian half-step displacement that we see a lot in Shostakovich and Prokofiev and many of the Russian plays? The second thing is, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the cultural background of these. And it seems to me that for example, the Milhaud is a very kind of thumbing at the nose, sort of gesture, whereas the Bartók seems to me to come from a sort of different world, even though musically the very similar things happen.
Thanks. About the first part of the question about the half-step displacement. We're talking a little bit about the Richard Bass article on chromatic displacement. I do think it's somewhat different in the sense that the chromatic displacement that he talks about in the Russian repertoire, Prokofiev especially, has to do with changes within the same layer that are occurring. Whereas this technology allows you to look at the confrontation between layers, rather than we have the displacement within the single layer. So I think they are modeling slightly different aspects. But I agree with you that Milhaud is a different world from Bartók. I do think that it's the vests, so to speak, of the music that are different. And if one is still allowed to speak about it this way in the 21st century, the structural dimension of the relation between scales, I think it holds for both. Then the way they compose it, and Milhaud in that sense is much more, each layer has more a tonal identity than Bartók's. Bartók is offering much more modal and even in this stage is already much more modal, scalar oriented, whereas Milhaud, even though you can think of it, and he preferred towards the end of his life, so as you notice, moved much more towards the scalar aspect and the contrapuntal aspect of polytonality, especially here in Saudades do Brasil. Each layer can for the most part, be heard as a different key. So that, I think that accounts for part of the difference, I think.
Vou fazer a minha pergunta em português, porque a minha pergunta é a seguinte: se você tem, me parece que os teus exemplos todos, você tem basicamente dois layers, né, o tempo todo. Minha pergunta é: o que acontece se você começar a colocar vários layers diferentes? Você pode continuar falando em politonalidade, ou a gente tem que abandonar a politonalidade e virar textura ou coisa parecida? Uma outra pergunta relacionada com isso é: você pode falar em politonalidade usando escalas, por exemplo, em vez de pentatônicas ou hexatônicas?
Sure. Okay, so the first question is, what happens when you consider more than two layers simultaneously? Do you need to start invoking questions of texture rather than polytonality? Well, I mean, I actually talked briefly about here a texture of five parts, and you can start to model. But I was problematizing the sense in which you can still hear polytonality once you start adding multiple voices. So yeah, I agree with you. There must be a point in which, and that feels in Milhaud's pieces, many of them, in that you have different parts in different keys, so to speak. It's very hard to hear polytonality in those cases, because then it gets such a dense structure that I agree, it's more texture than real polytonality. The other question was about,
Use of pentatonic.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. And I actually, I think I showed some examples, even in Milhaud, that for example, he is superposing a pentatonic against a diatonic. You know, any scale, you can superimpose any scales. And they might not even have direct mismatch, and that's when I talked about the concept of indirect dissonance. They just barely touch each other.
But less notes, you have less probability to have a mismatch, no?
Of course. Yes. Yeah, indirect mismatch.
For if you try to do, there's no sense. Well, I thought about serial music, but there's no.
Yeah, I mean, according to Casella, and I would agree, in serial music it's hard it's very easy to lose the sense of a layer, because you just, or at least the layers are not coherent with a single pitch content. So
Depends on how you compose that.
oh yeah, of course you can. And I'm sure you've done it.
Thank you. But I was going to say that one of the other factors you didn't mention, but it's very obvious, is if two styles of music are played together as in Ives, one will really hear the two keys. There won't be a problem. It's when the composer is trying to do the same style with the two keys that becomes a reality.
Okay, I think that we are run out of time. Okay, thank you so much for your bright conference. It was very nice. I have some questions, but I can talk later. So thank you.